So, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to the organizers of Chats and the Stacks. I've been obsessed with this series of events ever since I got here, so to be one of them is amazing. And I'm really excited to be introducing my book project, which just came out in December. I'm even more excited that, as Dan says, it's open access. So you can use this QR code or go to that URL and download it now, and no one's stopping you. It's amazing. Yeah. So the acknowledgements of this book start with an anecdote, which I want to share here too. So in Tokyo, almost 10 years ago, I was waiting on a station platform for a late night subway to arrive. And an obviously tipsy couple came up to me and struck up a conversation asking what I was doing in Japan. I said I was doing academic research. They said, what about? And I said, modern Japanese poetry. And there's a long pause. And the woman said, that is so boring. You are a boring person. This actually happened, and she switched into English just to say that, which hurt my feelings even more somehow. So I'm not going to argue that I'm not a boring person. I am, but I think she was wrong about poetry. But those feelings, I have to acknowledge, they're not uncommon, right, in Japan or elsewhere. Poetry is often associated with memorizing sort of correct interpretations of language that ranges from the archaic to the arcane in middle school and high school literature classes. The popular imaginary of poetry, especially modern poetry, is of something kind of cut off from the world and from other media, concerned only with itself. But I hope that this book might at least be a bit successful in showing how unboring modern Japanese poetry can be, and not just in terms of how many forms it can take, or how many types of people become poets, or how wild or weird or exciting some examples of it have been. Most of all, I want to show how it can matter not just to be able to express something in a different way, but to make expression itself into something different. So what might that look like? It might be a cinematic script that couldn't possibly be filmed. Maybe a set of voices chopped up and multiplied on a tape recorder. It could be a declaration in front of a train station by an activist with cerebral palsy, or a pop song about menstruation performed on live TV by a woman wearing giant dragonfly wings. Or it could be hundreds of augmented reality roses floating above the streets of Tokyo. All of these are actual examples of works called poems by their creators at different points over the last 100 years in Japan. They were, however, at the margins, to say the least, of conventional poetic practice. The majority weren't even considered poetry at the time by the literary establishment. They were ignored, treated as minor works, or even dismissed as frivolous. But I'd argue that these poets made radical interventions, not just in literature, but in the media culture of each era. Their works existed at the outer edges of both poetry making and media making, and used this position to rethink the possibilities of each. So Expanding Verse explores the role of experimental poetic practice in Japan from the 1920s all the way to the present, focusing on key moments of media transition. In it, I argue that experimental poetry didn't just engage with different forms of media, but was a primary mode of thinking about and creating media otherwise. I always made sure that the press put otherwise in italics because it's really important, otherwise, in opposition to dominant modes of composition and reception. Sometimes this meant experimenting with media more traditionally associated with the literary, the book, the journal, the page, the typeface. But sometimes this meant manipulating media technologies, newly emerging or at crucial points of inflection. Film, tape recording, pop music albums, online video, and smartphone apps. But all of these were different paths towards a more fundamental goal. Using poetry not just to evoke, but to create new ways of being and experiencing the world that pushed up against dominant media ideologies, technologies, and practices. Poetry became an alternative to systems of media that threatened to control, capture, and set limits on bodies and voices. So the poets in this book are a motley crew of silent film actresses, socialites, composers, bloggers, disability activists, feminist self-help authors, and pop stars, all of whom aim to create new forms of writing across different media and modes of embodiment, resulting in works that I think continue to resonate today. Their poems took the form not just of printed text, but of films, recordings, visual art, magazine spreads, collages, photographs, performances, protests, and stage events. They're written on concrete, vibrated through the air, and were assembled from ink, paper, light, bodies, voices, and reels of magnetic tape. Of course, poetry in print played a key role. It's still the dominant form of poetry in most places and remains a central concern throughout the book. But what I really wanted to ask in this book is what happens when you take these practices and treat them not as sort of exceptions or weird side examples, but as the main story, not as exceptional, but as key to how we think about poetry. Literature is largely conflated with certain forms of print media, and poetry, especially modern poetry, is often treated as a category of that. It's often held up, never mind, as the paragon of literary expression, right? You know, poetry is novel's weird older sister, unconcerned about capital and technology and popular media, backwards looking, bound to strict tradition, unpopular among the masses, mostly found in textbooks, journals, and if you're lucky, live readings at coffee shops where everyone talks like this, which I do a lot. Nothing wrong with that. But what if poetry is not just kind of a short type of literature littered with line breaks, but is something that always exists at the edges of media, as a mode of media practice? What happens when we understand poetry not as a medium or even a sub-medium, but something that comes into being when the borders of media themselves are expanded, transgressed, and reconfigured? So a big impetus for this project was going to both undergrad and grad school during a huge blossoming of Japanese media studies over the last 2-3 decades, and wondering why media and literature seemed still completely cordoned off from one another, and poetry, especially modern poetry, wasn't in the conversation at all. But I think that modern Japanese poetry is strikingly under-researched and under-taught compared to fiction, art, and film, both in Japanese and English language academia. But I like how poetry does what other forms of expression don't, kind of as its strategy or modus operandi. It has a tendency to be at the forefront of literary experimentation due to it being short, usually. It has a capacity to be incorporated into other media forms more agilely and intensely. It's kind of open to changes in media technology. So I'm less interested in this narrative of new media forms opening up literature to new possibilities, but the other way around, how literature can make media itself anew. Over and over, poetic practice was used as a way to think each medium otherwise and to find new possibilities at the edge of media. Title drop. And why Japan? So I get into this more in the book, of course, but Japan's long 20th century is a really striking example of the significance of thinking about poetry across and in relation to as a site of critique of media, which is the focus here. There were extraordinarily compressed changes in poetic form and language really quickly, and these were concurrent with vast social, political, and technological transformations, including media technological transformations, over the course of the century. So I think it's a really rich lens through which to consider these entangled relationships between media, language, the body, and artistic expression. In expanding this field of poetry under consideration beyond what are conventionally considered literary works, I want to clarify that I don't aim to dilute or diminish literature's role within a broader network of media practices, but the opposite, to take a stance that highlights the forces of literariness in places we're not conditioned to look for them. Along these lines, I want to emphasize the diversity of encounters between poetry and media, the poetic not as a medium, but as a mode, a stance, or an approach to composition and sensation that allows media to be rewritten. Finally, and importantly, disability plays a really key role in this book, not just as a main subject of 2 of its chapters, but in fundamentally informing and structuring my approach to poetry and media, and to poetry's interventions in media practice. There are countless critics, philosophers, novelists, and poets who have used disability as an easy metaphor, abstracting it into an alternative mode of being without any recognition of the lived experiences of disabled people. What better way to think about embodiment and sensation differently, about mediation, writing, reading, speaking, cognition, and movement, than to think about bodies that do these things differently and use this as a starting off point to open up our preconceived notions to other possibilities? Yet too often an approach like this, rather than centering disabled people, becomes another act of marginalization, making disability into another artistic or theoretical tool in the toolkit. And this temptation is particularly strong when looking at poetry. Modern poetry, especially the experimental stuff, favors the inarticulable, silent, strange, unspeakable. It strives for that which cannot be easily defined, claimed, pinned down, recovered, expressed, seen, heard, touched, thought, or felt. I take a cue from Legacy Russell, who proposes that the glitch that I argue poetry so often aims to be is at once error and erratum, a correction to the machine that can become a vehicle of refusal and a strategy of non-performance. But as Mara Mills and Jonathan Stern stress, we cannot resort to an easy celebration of glitch, error, noise, jamming, or hacking that simplistically holds up literal and metaphorical disabling as the most convenient other to the smooth functioning of contemporary corporatized media, end quote. In this book, I attempted to avoid the traps of this kind of approach, though I admit I was not always successful in doing so. But from its earliest stages, this book was informed by disability studies. It's reflected both in its consistent highlighting of disabled thinkers, poets, and media practitioners throughout, and in how it centers embodiment and sensation outside or actively against the norms or givens of how poetry and the body and mediation should function, not only focusing on the otherwise, but the constructedness of the normal against which the otherwise comes to be. So in the table of contents, you could see the admittedly bewildering range of works, eras, and media the book attempts to grapple with, starting with poetry and cinema in the 1920s and 30s, moving on to the 50s and early experiments with magnetic tape recording and the world's first tape recorder poem in Japan. Yokota Hiroshi is the cerebral palsy activist that I focused on a bit. The menstruation dragonfly lady, Togawa Jun, is one of the main focuses of the fourth chapter. And the last one is about two very different kinds of online poetry, augmented reality poetry and Japanese sign language poetry. But first I want to give you a bit of the first chapter and the last chapter as kind of a summing up. First, the 1920s and 30s. So this was a time in which a huge number of poets in Japan were writing thousands of poems about cinema. In the chapter's first section, I look at the works of women poets who compose poems about their own movie star fandom, doubling as criticism of the medium itself. In 1933, the queer poet and film theorist Osaki Midori identifies with Charlie Chaplin, writing in her poem of that name, "You were born in the autumn wind, blown this way and that by the autumn wind, all by your lonesome, a man of the autumn wind who doesn't say a thing." A woman writing under the pen name of Mizuho in 1929 writes of Clive Brooke, a British actor famous for playing gentleman thieves. "Clive, why does he trouble my heart so? When dawn breaks, his melancholy heart is recalled in loneliness, and there, heliotropes, in my bed, I think of that gentleman." The second section looks at the surrealist genre of the cinepoem, of poems in the form of imagined film scripts, based on a handful of French experiments, but which became a full-fledged poetic phenomenon in Japan, to the extent that people even started making fun of it and doing parodies of it. That's how you know you've made it. But here's the beginning of a famous one, 1929's Department Store. "It's an ascenseur opening and closing. No one is inside of it. 2, there are flowers lying on the floor. There are flowers without petals. 3, shoes, 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 galloping up the stairs, women's shoes. 4, in the middle, a shoe, its heel having come off," and so on. Takenaka Iku even dedicated this poem to Man Ray, even though he had just met Man Ray, and Man Ray was a huge jerk to him. Finally, the third section looks at poets who imagine the world itself becoming cinematized outside of the realm of the movie theater. Like Matsumoto Junzo, who in his 1924 poem notes that, "Even on a lonely suburban night, flashes of lightning are a futurist motion picture." But who I want to linger on in this section is a poet named Sagawa Chika. Throughout her all-too-brief career as a poet, and as one of the few prominent modernist women poets in interwar Japan, she took on something fundamental, what it means to see. Sagawa published the short poem Promenade in the third issue of Kobe-based poetry journal Cockfight in 1934, one of the key publications in the very cinema-centered Kobe modernism movement. "The season changes its gloves at 3 in the afternoon. The day fades. Petals burying pavement, a black and white screen, eyes covered by clouds. A day without promises falls into night." The film poems, cinepoems, and other film-related poetry that are explored in this chapter often use the trappings of the cinematic, not to center, but to challenge the primacy of vision and normative modes of visuality. This can be thought of as the creation of a kind of poetic visuality not inherently linked to sight. What might visuality look like that is not tied to an optical regime of the interplay of human vision and machine vision, of organic and inorganic lenses, and the production and reception of images? This was exactly the regime, of course, associated with the medium of cinema. In Japan, as in the rest of the world, film was seen as emblematic, the emblematic practice of a new, modern way of seeing, of arranging visual information, and of understanding the world through new logics of montage and mechanism. Sawako Nakayasu highlights the cinematic structure of Sensation in Sagawa's poems as well, how they, quote, operate in a fashion similar to a tableau or montage, placing images one after the other in the reader's eye, end quote. Promenade, however, contains seemingly the only explicit reference to cinema in any of Sagawa's works, with the mention of the black and white screen, shiro tokuro no screen. Yet, as tends to be the case in her poetry and that of most surrealists, the image is deliberately ambiguous. Is the screen a movie screen showing a black and white film? Or is the screen the pavement buried in the flower petals of the previous line, maybe white petals on black pavement or dark petals on white? Could it be that the eyes covered by clouds are themselves the screen, perceiving the world around them as black and white due to their occlusion? The presence of the cinematic, however, is unmistakable and can't be disentangled from the realms of nature, urban space, and the body that constantly intersect in her work. In Sagawa's Promenade, the cinematization of the landscape happens through a kind of implied interplay of shadows at the time of transition between season and times of day. But most striking to me is how these images operate for Sagawa. In this poem and her poetry more generally, the narrator tends to be first and foremost a spectator, though not in the way that can be completely reduced to the optical. Vision for Sagawa is a full-body experience, often a really painful one, in which the eye may or may not play a part, and imagery fluidly moves across multiple sensorial modes. And this is not only an aesthetic preference, but is linked to the embodied experience of Sagawa herself. A significant aspect of her poetry is its disability poetics, the main subject of my third chapter. Disability poetry is characterized by Jim Ferris as a, quote, foregrounding of the perspective of people with disabilities, with an emphasis on embodiment, especially atypical embodiment, and alternative techniques and poetics, end quote. This becomes especially relevant near the very end of the poem, where, as we mentioned, we are told that there are eyes covered by clouds. Hitomi wa kumo ni owarete. Indeed, this is a really repeated image in Sagawa's poetry. She has cloud-covered eyes gazing at black specks starting through the air in a poem called Blemish on the Grape. And Sagawa herself had low vision, and she lived with chronic illness since her childhood. Seeing bright daylight was often extremely physically painful for her. And I point this out not to position Sagawa in a way that resembles so many other depictions of blind and low-vision people by cited writers and artists as, quote, mysterious, mournful, and tragic, and as emblems of loss, end quote, as put by the blind art theorist Georgina Clige. Rather, I want to center how Sagawa's poetry can be thought through the poetics of cloud-covered eyes. The dominant framings of both poetry and cinema have in common an overwhelming focus on imagery as their central building block, whether on the screen or in the mind's eye. Yet throughout Sagawa's work, we are given different versions of what seeing could be. Light and shadow have color and texture, weight and pressure. Eyes might be covered by clouds, but that doesn't mean or only mean blindness. The clouds in Sagawa's work are simultaneously cumulus and cataract, suspended in the sky and descending towards earth, both massive natural forms and tiny bodily inflections. The whole body becomes a receptacle of feeling, where the senses converge into one and vision becomes touch, taste, scent, sound, and motion. The cinematic here is a moment of dramatic transition that resists being reduced to spectacle or even to the image. A shudder of light and dark, of softness and hardness, decontextualized from the space of the theater, but findable in flowers on top of concrete, or even within the low-vision eye itself. In general, I consider in the first 4 chapters of this book how poets use their work to rethink media from the edges, and how doing so they posit new forms that those media might take. And for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about digital media, which is no exception to these kinds of poetic intervention. The internet has in many ways been invited to the literary party in Japan. After a bit of a rough start, few within today's poetry circles take inherent issue with poetry on the internet, especially online poetry journals and anthologies. Yet the acceptance by the poetic establishment of one narrow kind of internet poetry, poems that sort of look like the stuff you read in journals or books, is a kind of acceptance that's predicated on the exclusion of a whole bunch of other kinds of poetry, like the works like the one I'll be talking about now. Forms of internet literature that fit neither the conventional ideas of how the internet should function or what literature should look like. So a major example of this is the work of someone who goes by the pen name of Nika. Starting in 2010, the Tokyo-based poet and artist Nika created what she called AR, or augmented reality poems, ARushi, a screen-based poetic form of which she is the most well-known practitioner and originator. So virtual reality is, putting on goggles or a helmet, it blocks out the rest of your visual field. Augmented reality is more if you have glasses, you could see through them, there's an overlay, or you have your smartphone or tablet, and it shows you what's behind it, but also what's in front of it. If you've ever played Pokemon Go, that's augmented reality. So to make her poems, Nika used this augmented reality smartphone app called Sekai Camera, World Camera, which allowed users to AirTag real-world locations with notes, photographs, and audio or video clips. So you looked at the space around you through the screen, and you could see what tags other people had left in the area, floating in the air in front of you. Cafe and restaurant recommendations, photos taken there, messages, audio notes, and so on. Kind of an augmented reality Yelp, basically. This debut in 2009 was really anticipated. There are a lot of big, impactful demonstrations that year and the year before, showcasing what Japan might look like if augmented reality was elegantly woven into the experience of walking around its cities, filled with user-generated content. Iguchi Takahito, who was the CEO at the time, said that it would cause people to look up at their phones, not down at their phones, which sounds horrifying to me. But the idea was that it would reorient your gaze to the world around you and just use the smartphone as a stepping stone in order to do that, with a new content platform literally floating in the air. Nika used this app, but did something dramatically different to it. At first, in early experiments in 2010, she used it as a tool to create location-based poetry. She brought her distinct, hyper-girly and chaotic aesthetic to the realm of augmented reality. But in the response of the events of 3/11, she used it to find a new way to mourn. Almost 20,000 people perished and more than 2,500 went missing in the triple disaster, earthquake, tsunami, nuclear meltdown of March 11, 2011 in the Tohoku region of Japan, including many of Nika's family members. Many things she said made it difficult to grieve properly. Her distance as someone born and raised in Tokyo, the complicity of the Tokyo-based power structures in allowing the Tohoku region to become so marginalized and the Fukushima meltdown to be so severe, and the fact that so many of the victims' bodies could never be recovered, contributing to a lingering sense of unreality. Recalling when she saw the meager bouquet on a relative's makeshift coffin, she wrote, "The colors of the flowers were a representation of the colors of life, but having been already plucked, they were also embodiments of death. There seemed to be suspended there something like an ephemeral augmented reality, a poetic sensation of aliveness and death." In other words, to Nika, augmented reality is not something limited to an app or device. It's a poetic sensation of contradictory overlay, of worlds coexisting in a kind of suspended impossibility. This impossibility itself became for her a poetic tool to express the impossibility of mourning, to use an app largely meant for photo sharing and restaurant recommendations, and to make it into something overwhelming. When seen through the screen, Nika's location-specific poems seem to fill the skies of Tokyo, taking up every centimeter of the smartphone's surface. But these words are only a small portion of the work that seem to actively draw attention to their own lack of power to articulate the magnitude of the disaster. Along these lines, even more important than the words is a sense of language exhausting itself. Alongside the text are symbols of mourning like paper cranes, roses, and candles. Sometimes they exist alongside scenes of the real world underneath. Sometimes they cover them up entirely. Nika takes an AR app designed for helpful commentary and uses it otherwise to evoke the impossibility of expression. So I want to look at a few more of these poems quite closely. Her post-3/11 AR poems are deliberately overwhelming, though, in scale and length, in their fury, and in their grief. In their original form, they existed within this iPhone app, but were thoroughly documented in a series of our blog posts. These blog posts, the first a week after the disasters and the last about a year after, became in effect the work itself, and the way most people experienced her poems. The first of her post-3/11 AR poems was captured in a post just a week after the disasters and was called Poetry Float to March 11, 2011 from Tokyo, floating number 1. 2011年3月11日へ向けて私は浮遊する from Tokyo, Daiichi Fuyu. This came to be the name for the series as a whole. Each blog post was a numbered installment called a floating, a Fuyu. There are 9 screen caps in total in this post, which you see some of here, all of seemingly nondescript Tokyo streets at night with brightly colored air tags floating over them. Looking at them, we could sort of imagine Nika walking aimlessly through the Tokyo streets, leaving tag after tag all the while. The first image is of 2 pink air tags with bubbled edges floating above the street in front of a Lawson convenience store. To March 11th, 2011, Nika is split across the 2 tags in white text. The second image is of a plush Hello Kitty seemingly in a store window. Each tag floating in front of it contains a fragment of text. Want to live, deikitai, is, mas. Here, /Tokyo, overflowing life. Poetry I am a poem. More photos, an underground walkway, a train platform, a darkened station, several shadowed crosswalks. The air tags multiply, image by image, 8 of them, 27 of them, 43 of them, sometimes cohering into readable phrases or sentences by color, and just as often not. Memory, one reads in Japanese, alongside life, swept away by the waves, for a requiem, turning towards life, with images, North Country, the hometown returning, actual bodies not shown. This is a poem of 2011, turning emptiness on the retina, overwhelmingly dropped, air tags on our home. Below the photos, there's a short piece of poetic blog text in which Nika hints at her personal connection to the disasters, and literally identifies herself as one and the same as her poetry, using the invented first-person pronoun watashi, which I translate here as poetry or poemi, a hybrid form of the word for poem and the most common word for I. To the parts of poemi who love the sea of Miyagi and were swept away by it, to everything that has no blood-earth connection, poetry float to Tokyo again. I am a poem. Nika, March 18th, 2011. The 7th post, and the final in this series, is the first with a subtitle, Manifesto for a Japanese Concrete Poetry Update. It features not only the longest text of the series by far, almost 8,000 characters long, but astonishing 132 AR poem photographs taken over the course of a day, requiring the reader to scroll down seemingly endlessly. If you were to copy and paste this whole poem into a Microsoft Word document, this one poem is about 100 pages long. It was posted just over a year after the disasters on March 16, 2012, but it's by far the most emotionally raw of her poems, a powerful indictment of Tokyo's apathy towards the victims and survivors, and once more a cry of desperation at the impossibility of language to capture what happened. What happens when this floating and wandering reaches the limits of mourning, mono genkai, she asks, in the face of mass death and disappearance? She likens her floating AR poems to the temporary makeshift burials of both identified and unidentified bodies, and criticizes the common terms to describe the disasters. Fukushima, the Great East Japan earthquake, Tohoku, and 3/11, as wholly inadequate zombie maquettes produced by the living. She spells Tokyo in capitalized Latin letters instead of the usual kanji, and calls it Tokyo, which is not really anywhere. Honto wa doku ni mo nai Tokyo. A place that conveniently pretends to be a non-place, free to ignore the horrors happening in other places. Unable to find the things that can't be found in those works of language aimed only at the living, I weep and cry out, and try to anticipate how language can't express with our existing zombie words the uncertainty of those who have become the dead and those of us who are still alive. Brimming over with tears of blood, I pry open unprecedented dimensions of language and pray 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 until language is annihilated, and pray 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 until its arrival, and pray 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 until it's broken. I can't mourn without risking my life, reaching towards or bringing into being the rifts within the space called AR, or the computer monitor, paper, the body, all media, and all spaces, without making my fundamentally floating experience itself come into being as words of mourning. I can't mourn, I can't mourn, I can't mourn. The 132 photos in this post are taken from the Tokyo City View observation deck in Roppongi Hills, looking down from a vantage point over 800 feet above sea level. There's some daylight left in the first few photos, and a few air tags floating, text fragments, candles, screenshots of her prior AR poems. As the images progress, the daylight quickly fades into a pitch black night. Nighttime is when Tokyo becomes its most iconic self, lights glimmering from its thousands of towering buildings. Many come up to these observation decks at night precisely to see this spectacle. But she takes a photo of the darkened view in front of her, maybe with a few flickering city lights visible or the orange glow of the Tokyo Tower. She takes another photo like this, and then another, rapidly walking around the observation deck. By the wavy lines and smearing lights, you can tell she's moving quickly, her hands trembling. She then takes each of these photos and makes them into air tags, obscuring the actual view of the city with dark, confusing blurs. Once again, she takes a screenshot of that AR scene, of the hundreds of photographs she has just taken, floating in front of the dark Tokyo landscape, ghostly white frames holding swaths of blackness and faint light blurs. She makes an air tag of these images too, each air tag containing hundreds of floating frames, and then in turn used to make an even denser cloud of air tags visible from the deck, with even less of the landscape visible, and so on, and so on, and so on, in seemingly endless repetition, a mise en abîme. We thus see even the words and images fall away, leaving only nighttime pictures of a screen where barely any of the city is visible, which are in turn filled with more frames of screens where barely any of the city is visible, and on into blankness, darkness, fogginess, and silence. Finally, some text tags start to appear again above the darkness and chaos. Cannot mourn. To 311. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. In this, like in the rest of her work, Nika twists and even arrests the communicative powers of the internet, of the screen, and of language. Here she places the user in a physical site meant to be the best view of Tokyo, but makes it impossible to see much of anything, making Tokyo absent to Tokyo in the way that it was absent to Tohoku. It takes the location-based nature of augmented reality and makes it into a delocation, a contradictory viewing deck made unviewable. Nika's poems are seemingly meant for an audience of Tokyoites. There were startling reminders to anyone who opened this app at certain locations or who saw the blog versions of these works, not just of the unignorable tragedy of thousands dead and missing, but of the ease with which Tokyoites had been insulated from that disaster. Underlying all of these poems are critiques of the Tokyo-based centers of power that made a natural disaster into a man-made one by decades of corruption, resource deprivation, and actively ignoring repeated warnings about the lack of proper safeguards. In the time after the disaster, the airwaves were thick with platitudes, reminders that all of Japan should work hard together, ganbara no hyon, of the bonds, kizuna, between all Japanese people, and so on, all of which rang hollow to many of those affected in Tohoku. Nika's work not only rejects language like this, but eventually comes to reject language almost entirely, moving from more conventional text-based air tags in her first poems to poems like these, where these are fully crowded out or replaced by other forms of mourning or healing, and then images stepping in where words fail. By the time you reach this floating, both have broken down. The blog post format is stretched to the limits by 100 pages worth of text and images, constantly repeating themselves, changing sizes and colors, the images canceling themselves out amidst the reader's scrolling descent down Nika's page. And that was in real time. That was about 4 minutes it would take. And that's if you don't read anything. This is poetry pushing the edges of both online publishing and augmented reality, and of user-generated content more generally. Both are made unusable by Nika's deliberate orchestrations of excess, the impossibly long posts, the CPU scorching screen filling, and the AR app crowded out by thousands of her tags all in one location, all of which require enormous amounts of processing power and smartphone battery drain, her poems not just hosted on the platform, but devouring it completely. Nika's AR works on a 311 function through what the disability literature scholar Arayuki calls a poetics of indictment, a kokuhatsu no shigaku. Here, the accusations are aimed towards Tokyo and Tokyoites, but also to herself. Nika's works are not simply examples of taking a media technology and subjecting it to error, glitch, or overwhelm for aesthetic purposes alone, but she uses these techniques to explore underlying structures of unequal access and marginalization of certain bodies central to processes of disabling and debilitation. Who's allowed to have a voice and who's not? Who can be mourned and who cannot? Which parts of Japan and Japanese society matter and which don't? Her poems arrest the communicative powers of augmented reality in order to lay bare the ideologies behind mediation at a time of crisis. In her hand, Sekai Camera stops being a platform for messages from Tokyoites to other Tokyoites, an intensified experience of their own city, and instead becomes a way to talk to ghosts, and for them to make their presence known in a floating digital space between the worlds of the living and the dead. Instead of focus, she creates distraction. Instead of helpful bits of information, she breaks down meaning in an information overload. Instead of an app that lends itself to a blithe everyday, she and so many of the other poets in expanding verse use an expanded idea of poetry to create a lens through which the ignored becomes the unignorable. Thank you. So
we'll take questions. I don't think we have a microphone, so just stand up and project.
yeah, and I'll repeat your question to the Zoom audience. Yep.
Andrew, thank you so much for this really fantastic talk, and congratulations on your book. This poem by Mika, I'm really just so deeply moved by the poem and your interpretation of it. I'm curious if there were any acoustic dimensions of the poem, or if it's solely a kind of a visual experience. And also, if you don't mind going back to that slide where you had the pray, pray, pray. Yeah, so that, just so struck by her very conscious use and of that repeated word. And it sounded to me a lot like chanting and a lot like, this embodied mourning, right, for those who've perished on 3/11. So I'm curious what your thoughts are also on this poem, possibly as a kind of oral performance, which might not be as obvious with the visual media, and if you think that she's potentially thinking of the genre of elegy as she's writing this.
Great. Thank you so much for that question. I'll summarize for the Zoom audience. The question was about whether there's sort of an acoustic or a sonic aspect to this poem, or was there originally, and also pointing out in this repetition of pray how it's sort of chant-like or elegy-like, and if there's sort of a performative dimension to this poem. Oh, audience, the question's coming in crystal clear. I don't have to summarize. Great. So there was an audio version aspect to this poem that was lost almost instantly. Sekai Camera was an extremely unstable app. And she noticed that as soon as she left audio air tags, they were gone. I've asked her what they were part of, and she would be reading some of the words aloud, but those were gone. And then the images started to disappear. Then the text started to disappear, and then the whole thing shut down the year after. So this is a ghost of a poem too. So much of what I had to do in this book was reconstruct what these poems would have been like because they don't exist anymore. It was a lot easier to do the stuff from the 1920s than the stuff from the 2010s because of the fragility not just of the internet, but of apps in particular, iPhone exclusive apps in particular. And they were degrading while people were using it, never mind now, 14 years later. But definitely what she was doing here was trying to evoke Buddhist chanting to a certain extent, but also in repeating pray so much it loses all meaning. So she wanted to make the words illegible as she continued to write and say them. She's very much about that kind of overwhelm that evacuates semantic content for certain effects. So I think she was doing both at once here. Thank you so much. Yep.
Hello, Professor Campana. I have two questions related to compare and contrast.
Yeah.
First is, in East Asia, there is a very popular form of modern poetry called the calligram, also known as visual poetry. What do you think are the similarities and differences between visual poetry and this type of poetry based on argumented reality? And my second question is the chanting, as mentioned by one of the audience. What do you think is the similarity between this chanting and the Japanese theater form of Buto, a type of theater form that developed after World War II, which also includes the making of certain voices without a specific meaning, but to evoke certain feelings, but to evoke ghosts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for those parallels to two really important practices, sort of calligram and visual poetry and Buto. So the subtitle of this poem was Manifesto for a Japanese Concrete Poetry Update. So this poem was also a manifesto saying that, hey, Japanese poetry needs to go in this direction. So she was really inspired by Japanese concrete poets in the 20s and in the 50s and 60s and wanted to make something akin to their work, but sort of reimagined for a new age. And she was influenced by theatrical forms too, but and Butoh often uses sort of disability aesthetics, non-normative embodiment and sensation and sound. But here, I think she was really unhappy with all the theatrical stuff going on after 311 too. There's a huge influx of post-311 theater. I think a lot of it's quite remarkable, but she almost found it as a thing that was cordoned off from the world in a way. So there's a famous film in Japan called Throw Away Your Books, Go Into the Streets from the 1970s by Terayama Shuji, and that was kind of literally what she did, going into the streets here.
Yes, I was thinking about the same director. I think the aesthetics are very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I was wondering about what seemed like a resonance between the two halves of your talk, and I'm wondering if it's simply the two chapters that would have been at opposite ends of the book were coming together for us, or whether you see a resonance there too, which is when we go over to Nika's blog, right? Yeah. It's a vertical string. Oh, sorry, the one with the photographs showing us.
Yes.
That you scrolled through?
Oh yeah, this one.
Yeah. Okay, and then maybe you scroll down and we've got into the string of images.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm aware that Japanese can be written in columns as well as rows. And yet what this looks like from however many feet away I am is a film strip.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was something that you wrote about in the book, or whether that's a resonance that you're seeing as well, because certainly she wasn't using columns within the text bubbles in the poem.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. And one thing that really drew me to this media expansive form of poetry in Japan is how they, especially in the digital context, is how they draw upon different Japanese art forms in order to like spatially expand what's going on. Early Japanese website designers were really inspired by emaki, sort of picture scrolls that you unroll and they could extend up to 40 feet. So they thought now that we're bringing the scrolling into the digital age, we have a lot of precedent for the scroll and we can make sense of this using that. Whereas Nika very much played with the vertical rather than the horizontal scroll as much as possible. And yeah, she definitely pointed to film reels as a big inspiration for how she structured this with the sort of, or even a flip book. Just sort of as you scroll seemingly similar images, you see the change over and over again, and you could linger or you could not. So absolutely, this is what I started with, and then when I started to find things that felt like this in 1920s cinepoetry, I'm like, is this a book? I guess this is a book. Thank you. Yep. Yes.
I know in order to reproduce this, you had to get into the code and the way that this blog post was, in order to sort of save it, you had to sort of analyze it on a more dimensional level. And I'm curious about what you think the level of sort of care and detail in the production of the blog and the way that she sort of created the digital space. Because some of this stuff is like ready-made blog software that's third party that she'd be using, and she's using apps from other developers, and yet she's putting a sort of handwork into it that seems very particular to her. And I just want to hear you talk a little bit about either A, about craft, or B, about care in terms of how she manages the apps and the programs that she's using and how she thinks of them, or if they're sort of transparent tools to her.
I love that question. Thank you so much. So Nika has always said that her main inspiration and who she thinks are the most important poets in Japanese history are teenage girls online in the late 90s and early 2000s. And she started off as a middle school blog poet. And she says she's furious at how they've been sort of dismissed from Japanese artistic and literary history because they were casually making websites that looked like this for each other, but they weren't treated as the avant-garde spectacles they are. They're treated as silly girls on the internet doing silly things, right? And part of that is like reimagining craft in that lens, where it's like you take sort of ready-mades, these sort of, you can download an app that makes roses bloom across your blog. And she's like, okay, I'm going to put 40 of them all at once and make it break down. I'm going to use these icons from icon databases. I'm going to find the cutest Hello Kitties and make a pyramid out of them. The average post, she said, takes 30, 40 hours to put together. They're very carefully used. And it's not like she's drawing things from scratch, but that's part of the point. She's like drawing on a kind of ready-made culture of teenage girl aesthetics in Japan, and seeing that as like the new kind of poetic expression that needs to be recognized and spread more. So yeah, that's part of the re-enchanting of digital web, digital craft, I think, is a big part of her work here.
Professor?
Yes.
This is Wendy online. I have
Hello.
a question for you, and I also wanted to remind you to get into the camera shot, which you were moving a little out of.
Okay.
So yes. So I'm going to read a question for you. Thanks for your presentation, and again, congratulations on your publication. My question is about this powerful interplay of image and text in Ikanya's poetry. What motivated her to integrate image into poetry? Also, how does the image accompanying poetry differ from a more traditional text-only poetry, in your opinion? And also, I want to clarify that this questioner said, oh, he's answering part of this right now.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to expand upon it a bit more, though, because one thing that a lot of Japanese poets and Chinese poets are frustrated by in terms of their international reception is a misunderstanding of how Chinese and Chinese characters work, and the fact that their poetry is already inherently pictorial. And so some poets obviously lean into that, and Nika does that too, and a lot of other poets certainly. But this is part of why I think she frames her poetry as Japanese concrete poetry for a new age, where she's really interested in the word and character-like layout of non-character things, forcing us to take emoji seriously as part of the Japanese language and something like that. So I think she's less about sort of the text and image interplay and more about making us question the fundamentals of what text and image means in the first place in a way that's much more free and open and terrifying. Yeah. Thank you so much, Wendy. Eric?
Thanks, Andrew, and congrats. I have a question about poetry and translation. So I was thinking back to all the cliches about poetry you were kind of unmaking at the beginning of your talk. Yeah. And at least for me, one of those is probably that poems are untranslatable. But clearly that's not always the case. And we read some wonderful translations of some of these poems today. Could you walk us through some of your approaches to translating this kind of poetry? And I was thinking particularly about the examples you gave us of the poetry and the poemy and some of these other kind of creative translation choices that you made. Can you give us any other examples from the book of translation choices you had to make or anything that was untranslatable?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is something that I had to grapple with a lot when making this book, and a lot of it was based on my experiences in a very different zone. I was part of a computational literary lab at MIT called the Trope Tank, where I was part of a project called Renderings, where we realized there's electronic literature made across the globe, but most of the stuff that gets canonized and collected is English language and Anglophone electronic literature. And that's a part of that is because of the multiple barriers in translation, not just the language itself, but also the fact that you have to recode things or re-encode things or go into the code and translate those things too. So one of the first things I did was translate a lot of Nika's work, which involved going into the HTML source code and translating it character by character and making sure that the layout doesn't break. And also, her poems are almost impossible to understand, even in Japanese. The language is so difficult. So letting that free me to make poems that were impossible to understand in English too. I really I value to recreate the experience of a person reading the original for the first time. But another thing is to recognize that most of the poets I'm looking at here, by virtue of the weirdness of their work, were very globally looking. They're constantly in correspondence with poets in China, in the UK, in Canada, in Brazil, and in the United States, I guess. And they themselves were translators, so I often looked at their own translation of works from other languages as a cue to how I should approach translating them. So Sagawa Chika translated works by Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, for example. She really valued a kind of modernist stream of consciousness beauty, and that's something I tried to bring back into how I translate her work too. But thank you so much for coming to this. I really appreciate it.